Hortus Conclusus. Hortus Conclusus is a Latin term meaning literally enclosed garden. At their root, both of the words in Hortus Conclusus refer linguistically to enclosure. It describes a genre of garden that was enclosed as a practical concern, a major theme in the history of gardening. Having roots in the Song of Songs in the Hebrew Scriptures, the term Hortus Conclusus has importantly been applied as an emblematic attribute and a title of the Virgin Mary in medieval and Renaissance poetry and art, first appearing in paintings and manuscript illuminations about 1330. The Virgin Mary as Hortus Conclusus. Actual gardens. All gardens are by definition enclosed or bounded spaces, but the enclosure may be somewhat open and consist only of columns, low hedges, or fences. An actual walled garden, literally surrounded by a wall, is a subset of gardens. The meaning of Hortus Conclusus suggests a more private style of garden. In the history of gardens, the high medieval Hortus Conclusus typically had a well or fountain at the center, bearing its usual symbolic Fratesi fountain of life in addition to its practical uses. The convention of 4 paths that divided the square enclosure into quadrants was so strong that the pattern was employed even where the paths led nowhere. All medieval gardens were enclosed, protecting the private precinct from public intrusion, whether by folk or by stray animals. The enclosure might be as simple as woven wattle fencing, or of stout or decorative masonry, or it might be enclosed by trellis-work tunneled pathways in a secular garden or by an arcaded cloister for communication or meditative pacing. The origin of the cloister is in the Roman colonnaded peristyle, as garden histories note. The ruined and overgrown Roman villas that were so often remade as the site of Benedictine monasteries had lost their planted garden features with the first decades of abandonment. Gardening, more than architecture, more than painting, more than music, and far more than literature, is an ephemeral art. Its masterpieces disappear, leaving little trace. Georgina Masson observed when, in 1070, the Abbey of Cassino was rebuilt, the garden was described as a paradise in the Roman fashion, but it may have been merely the aura of the great classical tradition alone that had survived. The 9th century idealized plan of St. Gall illustration shows an arcaded cloister with a central well and cross paths from the centers of each range of arcading. But when a consciously patterned garden was revived for the medieval cloister, the patterning came through Norman Sicily and its hybrid culture that adapted many Islamic elements, in this case the enclosed North African courtyard gardens, ultimately based on the Persian garden tradition. The practical enclosed garden was laid out in the treatise by Pietro Crescenzi of Bologna, Liber Ruralium Commodorum, a work that was often copied, as the many surviving manuscripts of its text attest, and often printed in the 15th and 16th centuries. Late medieval paintings and illuminations in manuscripts, such as for the Romance of the Rose, where the garden in the text is largely allegorical, often show a turfed bank for a seat as a feature of the Hortus Conclusus. Only in the 15th century, at first in Italy, did some European gardens begin to look outward. Sitting, walking, and playing music were the activities most often portrayed in the numerous 15th century paintings and illuminated manuscripts where strenuous activities were inappropriate. In Rome, a late 15th century cloister at San Giovanni dei Genosi was constructed for the use of the Genos Natio, and Ospitium Genosium, as a plaque still proclaims, which provided shelter in cubicles off its vaulted encircling arcades, and a meeting place and shelter reuniting those from the distant home city. Somewhat earlier, Pietro Barbo, who became Pope Paul Roman II in 1464, began the construction of a Hortus Conclusus, the Palazzetto del Giardino di San Marco, attached to the Venetian cardinal's Roman seat, the Palazzo Venezia. It served as Paul's private garden during his papacy. Inscriptions stress its secular functions as sublimes monibus hortos. Aut relever animum de ras propeller cures, a garden of sublime delights. a retreat from cares, and praise it in classicizing terms as the home of the Dryads, suggesting that there was a central grove of trees, and mentioning its snowy. An 18th-century engraving shows a tree-covered central mount, which has been recreated in the modern replanting, with box-bordered cross and saltire gravelled paths. The Farnese Gardens Orti Farnesiani sul Palatino, or Gardens of Farnese upon the Palatine, were created by Vignola in 1550 on Rome's northern Palatine hill for Cardinal Alessandro Farnese 1520–89. These become the first private botanical gardens in Europe, the first botanical gardens of any kind in Europe being started by Italian universities in the mid-16th century, only a short time before. Alessandro called his summer home at the site Horti Farnesiani, probably in reference to the Hortus Conclusus. These gardens were also designed in the Roman peristylium style with a central fountain. Again, in the age of the automobile, the enclosed garden that had never disappeared in Islamic society became an emblem of serenity and privacy in the Western world. In art, the Hortus Conclusus was one of a number of depictions of the Virgin in the late Middle Ages developed to be more informal and intimate than the traditional hieratic enthroned Virgin adopted from Byzantine icons or the coronation of the Virgin. The subject began as a specific metaphor for the Annunciation, but tended to develop into a relaxed sacra conversation, with several figures beside the Virgin seated and less specific associations. Germany and the Netherlands in the 15th century saw the peak popularity of this depiction of the Virgin, usually with child and very often a crowd of angels, saints, and donors, in the garden. The garden by itself, to represent the Virgin, was much rarer. Often walls or trellises close off the sides and rear, or it may be shown as open, except for raised banks, to a landscape beyond. Sometimes, as with a Gerard David's The Virgin and Child with saints and donor below the garden is very fully depicted; at other times, as in engravings by Martin Scongor, only a wattle fence and a few sprigs of grass serve to identify the theme. Italian painters typically also keep plants to a minimum and do not have grass benches. A sub-variety of the theme was the German Madonna of the Roses, sometimes attempted in sculptured altar pieces. The image was rare in Orthodox icons, but there are at least some Russian examples. One type of depiction, not usually compatible with correct perspective, concentrates on showing the whole wall and several garden structures or features that symbolize the mystery of Christ's conception, mostly derived from the Song of Songs or other biblical passages, as interpreted by theological writers. These may include one or more temple or church-like buildings, an ivory tower SS 7.4, an open-air altar with Aaron's rod flowering, surrounded by the bare rods of the other tribes, a gatehouse tower of David, hung with shields SS 7.4, with the gate closed, the Ark of the Covenant, a well often covered, a fountain, and this type of depiction usually shows the Annunciation, although sometimes the child Jesus is held by Mary. A rather rare, late 15th century variant of this depiction was to combine the Annunciation in the Hortus Conclusus with the hunt of the unicorn and Virgin and unicorn, so popular in secular art. The unicorn already functioned as a symbol of the Incarnation, and whether this meaning is intended in many prima facie secular depictions can be a difficult matter of scholarly interpretation. There is no such ambiguity in the scenes where the Archangel Gabriel is shown blowing a horn as hounds chase the unicorn into the Virgin's arms, and a little Christ child descends on rays of light from God the Father. The Council of Trent finally banned this somewhat over-elaborated, if charming depiction, partly on the grounds of realism, as no one now believed the unicorn to be a real animal. In the 16th century the subject of the Hortus Conclusus drifts into the open-air Sacra Conversazione, and the Madonnas in a landscape of Giovanni Bellini, Albrecht Dürer, and Raphael, where it is hard to say if an allusion is intended. An exhibition of later medieval visual representations of Hortus Inclusus was mounted at Dumbarton Oaks, Washington, D.C. The exhibition drew a distinction between garden representations as thematic reinforcements and those that seemingly treat the garden as a subject in itself, In reviewing it, Timothy Husband warned against uncritical interpretation of the refined late medieval garden imagery by subjugating direct observation. South Netherlandish illuminations and painting appear to document the turf benches, fountains, raised beds, estrade trees, potted plants, walkways, enclosing walls, trellises, wattle fences, and bowers familiar to contemporary viewers, but assembled into an illusion of reality. Modern cultural references. The concept for the 2011 Serpentine Gallery Pavilion was the Hortus Conclusus, a contemplative room, a garden within a garden. Designed by Swiss architect Peter Zumthor, and with a garden created by Piet Oudolf, the pavilion was a place abstracted from the world of noise and traffic and the smells of London, an interior space within which to sit, to walk, to observe the flowers.